Hello and welcome to the first video on mitochondria and energy production. So in today's video we're going to learn about ATP production, and in order to do that we first need to understand the structure and the roles of mitochondria. Mitochondria were first discovered in the 19th century by German pathologist Richard Altman. And he visualized these using a light microscope, and he saw these as large organelles within the cell. Mitochondria are usually depicted as little round cylinders. They're about 0.5 to 1 micron in diameter, but they're remarkably plastic, meaning that they can change shape, they can move around the cell, and they can even fuse together to create big groups of mitochondria, and then they can move apart. So they're not just fixed organelles with the same shape and size all the time. As you can see in this diagram here of a cell stained in blue, in the green we have the mitochondria, and the red we have the nucleus. You can see that mitochondria quite often form like mesh-like networks which go from the nucleus around to the periphery of the cell. But where do mitochondria come from? So the most widely accepted theory is that long time ago there was an ancestral eukaryotic cell, and this just happened to engulf a free-living oxygen metabolizing bacterium. Once inside the cell, the mitochondrion, or the bacteria at the time, would have then developed a double membrane. And we think this is because they have a very similar size to bacteria. They actually have their own DNA, their own genome, which is circular. And they also possess their own ribosomes and tRNAs. So obviously at some point in the past, they were free-living organisms because they had their own genetic code and they can make their own proteins. Similarly, today, the mitochondria will also produce their own proteins, but they also rely on proteins which are made from our own genes, the DNA in the nucleus of the cell, and these proteins are transported into the mitochondria. Mitochondria have many roles, and the one that we're going to focus on in this series of videos is their ability to generate energy, or ATP. But they're also involved in regulation of cytosolic calcium concentrations. They're very important in the regulating or buffering the redox potential of cells, and they do this by regulating levels of NAD and NADH, and we'll talk about those molecules a little bit later in one of the other videos. They also play a role in the detoxification of ammonia, and this is through a cycle called the urea cycle. But they're also responsible for the production of heat, and again we'll talk about this a little bit later in the third video. And finally, as you've probably come across already, that they also play a role in programmed cell death, or apoptosis. The number of mitochondria that you can find in any given cell really depends on the energy requirements. So obviously, if cells require more energy, you will find more mitochondria. A typical cell will have around 200 mitochondria inside. Liver cells, which are involved in glycogen storage and also detoxification, have around 1,000 to 2,000 mitochondria, so they're very energy needing cells, so they have more mitochondria. And for an example, in athletes in skeletal muscle, they will have around 4,000. Conversely, in some cell types, such as fat cells or skin cells, which don't require a lot of energy, the number of mitochondria is only few. As well as numbers, the localization of mitochondria can be different in different cell types. And here we have a image of a muscle tissue. And you can see here quite clearly that the mitochondria are found in rows next to the contractile fibers. And this is quite obvious because where the muscles contract, we need lots of energy. And mitochondria are producing the energy, the ATP, that's required for muscle contraction. And so this is where you would expect to find the mitochondria. So what does a mitochondria look like? Well, as we've talked already, that they really do differ in shape and size according to cell type and energy requirements, but they are usually depicted as seen in the image on the screen. We have the typical cylindrical shape. They have two specialized membranes. They have an inner membrane and an outer membrane. The space between the two membranes is called the intermembrane space. And then we have what's called the internal matrix, which is inside, and this will contain the DNA, the ribosome, and the enzymes required for the citric acid cycle, which we'll talk about in another video. The inner membrane is particularly specialized in that it is impermeable to ions, and this is the site of the electron transport chain and the site for ATP synthesis, which again we will cover in the next two videos. The inner membrane, as you can see from the pictures that we've showed so far, is highly convoluted. It has many folds. These folds are called cristae. And what they do is they serve to massively increase the surface area of the inner membrane. And this is important because this is where the chemical reactions will take place to produce ATP. The matrix contains lots of enzymes which are involved in the metabolism of pyruvate and fatty acid, which then goes into a cycle called the citric acid cycle, which produces the molecules which are required for oxidative phosphorylation, which is involved in the production of ATP. If you'd like to read any more about mitochondria, then I suggest you read chapter 17 of Straya, and thank you very much for listening.